A peaceful day at the park turns tense when a father and his daughter are confronted by suspicion, challenging their love and the biases of those around them. It was a warm Sunday afternoon in Greenfield Park, Ohio, the kind of day when families filled picnic tables, kids laughed on swings, and couples strolled lazily under the shade of tall oak trees. Among the sea of happy faces was a man named Darren and his 6-year-old daughter Emma. Darren had packed a simple lunch: peanut butter sandwiches, apple slices, and a thermos of lemonade. They sat on a faded blue blanket, spread out on the grass laughing, as Emma told him about her plans for first grade. Darren was the kind of dad who always made time for the little things. His easy laugh and the way he listened made Emma feel like the most important person in the world. Today was no different. He playfully tugged on her tiny braid as she showed him a wobbly tooth, her bright blue eyes sparkling with excitement. Not far away, an older woman sat alone on a bench, her gaze fixed on them. Darren noticed her briefly but paid little mind. People often stared. He was used to it. Being a black father to a white daughter meant catching curious glances. Sometimes people smiled warmly, but other times, like today, their expressions told a different story. Still, Darren brushed it off. He focused on Emma, who had just spotted the playground. "Can I go?" she asked, already halfway to her feet. "Go ahead, but stay where I can see you," Darren said, chuckling. As she darted off, he leaned back, enjoying the moment, unaware that the woman on the bench was dialing 911. But peaceful moments don't last forever, and Darren was about to find himself in a situation that would change everything. Emma's laughter carried across the playground as she climbed the jungle gym, her pink sneakers dangling as she swung from one bar to the next. Darren watched her closely, his gaze steady but soft. He always kept a careful eye on her, knowing the world wasn't always kind to families like theirs on the bench. The woman lowered her phone. After a hushed conversation with the dispatcher, her lips were pressed into a thin line as she stood and started walking toward the playground. Her steps were deliberate, her face set with an expression Darren recognized all too well, one of suspicion disguised as concern. She stopped near the jungle gym, her voice loud enough to be heard over the chatter of children. "Excuse me," she said, directing her words at Emma. "Where's your mommy?" Emma paused, gripping the metal bar tightly. "I'm here with my dad," she replied innocently, pointing toward Darren, who was already standing. He took a few steps closer, his brow furrowing as he assessed the situation. "Is there a problem?" Darren asked, his tone calm but firm. The woman turned to face him, her eyes scanning him with thinly veiled judgment. "I was just checking," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "You don't look related," Darren sighed, his patience wearing thin. "She's my daughter," he said plainly. Emma, sensing the tension, climbed down and ran to his side, clutching his hand. The woman didn't back down. "Well, you can't be too careful these days," she muttered, glancing at Emma as if looking for signs of distress. Darren knelt to Emma's level, his voice soft as he said, "Why don't you grab your water bottle, sweetheart?" "I'll be right here," Emma nodded, her small face troubled. As she walked back to the blanket, the woman crossed her arms, her stance challenging. "You can understand why this looks unusual," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A man like you with a child like her." Darren straightened, his jaw tightening. "A father spending time with his daughter shouldn't look unusual," he replied evenly, refusing to let her words shake him. But before the conversation could go further, the sound of sirens in the distance broke through the park's usual noise. Darren's heart sank. The woman's eyes darted toward the parking lot, a hint of satisfaction flickering across her face. But Darren knew this was only the beginning, and he had to stay calm for Emma's sake. The wail of sirens grew louder, drawing the attention of everyone in the park. Conversations quieted, and parents pulled their children closer, As two patrol cars rolled to a stop near the playground, Darren stood his ground, his posture calm but guarded, while Emma clutched her water bottle on the blanket, her wide eyes darting between her father and the flashing lights. Two officers stepped out, one man and one woman, their expressions professional but serious. The woman, who had made the call, approached them immediately, gesturing toward Darren as she spoke in hushed tones. Darren couldn't hear her words, but he knew their weight. He took a steadying breath, reminding himself to stay composed. The male officer approached first, his hand resting lightly on his utility belt. "Sir, can we have a word?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The female officer stayed back, her eyes scanning the scene, as if searching for signs of trouble. Darren nodded. "Of course," he said, his voice steady. He glanced toward Emma and gave her a reassuring nod. She didn't move but sat frozen, her tiny hands gripping the bottle, like it was a lifeline. The officers' questions came quickly, each one poking at Darren's patience. "What's your name? What are you doing here? Who's the child?" Darren answered each one, clearly keeping his tone measured, despite the frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "She's my daughter," he said firmly, his eyes meeting the officers without hesitation. "Her name is Emma. We come here every weekend." The officer glanced toward the woman, who was now standing with the female cop, still gesturing animatedly. "We received a call about a possible abduction," he said, his voice tinged with skepticism. The caller said, "The child doesn't appear to be related to you." Darren's chest tightened, but he refused to let anger take over. "She's adopted," he explained. "We've been a family since the day she was born. There's no story here, just a father spending time with his daughter." Emma, sensing the tension, stood up and walked over to Darren. "Daddy," she said softly, her voice trembling. The officer looked down at her, his expression softening slightly. The woman interjected from behind. "Just check his story. You can't be too careful," she insisted, her voice rising. The female officer stepped forward. "We'll need some identification, sir," she said, her tone more neutral. Darren nodded and reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet with deliberate movements. "This is my driver's license," he said, handing it over. "And this is a copy of Emma's adoption paperwork." He retrieved a folded document from his bag, keeping his hands steady as he handed it over. The officers exchanged a look, then began reviewing the papers. Meanwhile, the woman stood off to the side, her arms crossed and a triumphant look on her face. Darren kept his focus on Emma, who clung to his leg, as if she could sense his inner turmoil. But Darren knew the truth would prevail, and this was just another moment where he'd have to prove his love for his daughter against someone else's doubt. The female officer unfolded the adoption papers carefully, her eyes scanning the document, while her partner verified Darren's ID. The seconds dragged on, each one stretching longer than the last. Darren stood motionless, his heart pounding, but his face betrayed no sign of it. Emma, still clutching his leg, whispered, "Are we in trouble, Daddy?" He crouched down, gently smoothing her hair. "No, sweetheart," he said softly, "we're not in trouble." Finally, the female officer looked up from the paperwork and met Darren's eyes. Her expression had shifted, the rigid professionalism softening into something closer to understanding. "Everything checks out," she said, handing back the documents. "I'm sorry for the inconvenience, Mr. Johnson." The male officer nodded and added, "Thank you for cooperating. It's clear there's nothing wrong here." The woman who had called the police stepped forward, her voice rising again. "You're just going to leave it at that? Look at them. Doesn't this seem odd to you?" The female officer's tone hardened. "Ma'am, the documents are legitimate. There is no issue here." Darren exhaled slowly, relieved but still holding on to his composure. "I understand the concern," he said, addressing the woman directly, "but assumptions like these can cause real harm. My daughter doesn't deserve to feel unsafe." Just because our family doesn't look like what some people expect, Emma, still clinging to him, added quietly, I love my daddy. He's the best. Her small voice carried through the quiet park, and suddenly the tension in the air seemed to crack, giving way to an uncomfortable silence. The woman faltered, her indignation replaced by something that looked like guilt. Her gaze dropped to the ground, her shoulders slumping slightly around them. The onlookers who had gathered began murmuring. Some looked at Darren with quiet sympathy, others with shame. One by one the spectators turned back to their picnics and conversations, the spectacle losing its hold. But for Darren the damage had already been done. Emma's innocent question, "Are we in trouble?" lingered in his mind, a painful reminder of how fragile their peace could be. The officers stepped back toward their patrol cars. The female officer paused before leaving and said, I hope you and your daughter have a good rest of your day. Darren nodded, appreciating her attempt to smooth over what had already been an emotional ordeal, but even as the officers drove away, Darren knew the hardest part of the day wasn't over yet. It was explaining to Emma why this had happened at all. As the patrol cars disappeared down the winding road, Darren noticed how the park's atmosphere had shifted. Conversations resumed, but there was a palpable tension in the air. People avoided eye contact, their discomfort as visible as the sunlight filtering through the trees. Darren turned his focus to Emma. Kneeling to her level, "Hey kiddo," he said gently, "you okay?" Emma's big blue eyes stared into his, brimming with questions she didn't yet know how to ask. "Why did that lady think we're not family?" she whispered, her small hands twisting the fabric of her shirt. Darren paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people don't understand things that are different," he explained. "But being different doesn't mean something's wrong. We know we're family and that's what matters." Emma nodded slowly, her young mind processing the moment in a way Darren wished she didn't have to. A couple sitting on a nearby blanket caught his eye. They hesitated, then walked over, their young son trailing behind them. "Hey," the man said awkwardly. I wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened." "That was wrong," his wife chimed in. "Your daughter is lucky to have you. You handled that so well." Darren gave them a small appreciative smile. "Thanks. I just hope next time people think twice before assuming the worst." More passers-by offered quiet smiles and nods of solidarity as they passed Darren and Emma, their gestures small but meaningful. It didn't erase what had happened, but it reminded Darren that not everyone viewed the world through the same narrow lens. As the crowd thinned, the woman who had made the call remained seated on the bench, her gaze fixed on her lap. Darren debated walking over, but decided against it. Her regret was evident, and any conversation now felt unnecessary. "Daddy," Emma said, tugging on his sleeve. "Can we go home now?" "Of course, sweetheart," he replied, gathering their things. He placed a hand on her shoulder as they walked toward the car, feeling the weight of the day, but also the strength that came from being her father. But as they left the park, Darren resolved to use this moment not as a source of anger, but as a way to teach Emma and others that love and understanding can overcome even the deepest biases. The drive home was quiet, with Emma staring out the window, lost in thought. Darren glanced at her through the rearview mirror, wondering how to explain something so complicated to someone so young. He decided to keep it simple. "Emma," he began, breaking the silence, "remember how we talked about kindness, how it's important to treat people with love, even if they don't always do the same?" She nodded, still gazing out at the passing trees. "Like when you said that being nice makes the world better." "That's right," Darren said. "Today that lady didn't understand us, and she made a mistake, but we don't have to let her mistake define how we feel about our family." Emma turned to him, her little voice steady. "I love our family, you're my dad, and nobody can change that." Darren smiled, his chest tightening with pride. "And I love you more than anything." Later that evening, as Darren tucked Emma into bed, she hugged him tightly. "I think that lady needs to learn about kindness too," she said softly. "Maybe she does," Darren replied, "but what's most important is that you always remember who you are and how much you're loved." As he left her room, Darren couldn't help but reflect on the day. It had been painful, yes, but it was also an opportunity to teach Emma about the strength of their bond and the importance of compassion, even in the face of ignorance. The next weekend, Darren and Emma returned to the park, their favorite blue blanket in tow. This time they were met with smiles from familiar faces, some from the week before. The world hadn't changed overnight, but small gestures reminded Darren that progress, however slow, was still possible, because every moment of understanding, every act of kindness, plants a seed that can grow into something greater. And as Darren watched Emma laugh on the swings, he knew those seeds started with families like theirs. As they drove home, the silence in the car was comfortable, the weight of the day starting to fade into the background. Darren glanced at Emma in the rearview mirror, her gaze fixed on the passing scenery, lost in thought. "Hey, kiddo," Darren said softly, his voice breaking the quiet. "Remember how we talked about how important it is to treat people with kindness, no matter what?" Emma looked up at him, her small face serious. "Like when I said that being nice makes the world better?" "Exactly," Darren replied with a warm smile. "You've got a good heart, Emma, and I'm proud of you for showing kindness, even when others might not." Emma nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "I just want people to be nice." Darren's heart swelled with pride. "Me too, sweetheart. The world could use a lot more people like you." They drove on, the streets lined with the fading light of dusk. In that quiet, peaceful moment, Darren knew that no matter how many challenges they faced, they would always find their way through together, guided by the love they shared and the lessons that would shape them both. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Darren parked the car and turned off the engine. He sat there for a moment, thinking back to the park, the looks, the misunderstandings, and the judgment. But through it all, his resolve had only strengthened. He had promised himself that he would teach Emma how to live without fear, how to carry herself with dignity in the face of ignorance, and how to always stand up for what's right. Emma unbuckled her seatbelt and reached for the door handle. "Can we come back to the park next weekend?" Darren chuckled softly, opening his door. "Of course we will, sweetheart. We'll always come back, because that's our park, and it's a part of our story." As they walked inside, hand in hand, Darren knew that no matter the struggles they faced, the bond they shared would always be unbreakable. It wasn't just about overcoming prejudice, it was about raising Emma to see beyond the surface, to embrace every difference as a strength, and to always choose love over fear. And with each new day, that love would be their guiding light, leading them through a world that was slowly but surely starting to understand that love has no boundaries. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, we all have the power to make a difference. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that inspire change and reflection.